Well, good morning and welcome. My name is Laura Parsons. I'm the Communications Director for the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. We're here today to talk about black carbon, a component of soot that has serious implications for disease and mortality rates all across the globe. And although not a greenhouse gas, also contributes to global climate change. So we're very pleased that we have an expert panel here today to help walk us through some of the climate science, help us understand the magnitude of the health problem, and better yet, to talk about some of the solutions. So without further ado, I think we should get right into it, and I'll introduce Ben D'Angelo, Senior Analyst for Climate Change Science and Policy with the EPA, and also co-chair for the Task Force on Short-Lived Climate Forcers for the Arctic Council. Ben.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to jump right into it, so I'll try to be brief so that we have more time for Q&A. So what I'm going to cover is just some black carbon 101, mostly on the science. One of my key messages is that the science is evolving on this topic. We don't have all of the answers yet about the climate effects, but there is a lot of work going on, and I think we're getting there in terms of better answers. I'll show you some of the ongoing efforts that are happening both within EPA and outside of EPA. There is a lot going on this topic right now, and then at the end and throughout, I'll give you what I think are some key messages on this issue, given the state of knowledge and the evolving state of knowledge. So just some basic points. First of all, black carbon, most of you may already know this, but black carbon is a component of particulate matter, PM, which we already regulate in this country and a lot of countries for air quality purposes. So not for climate purposes, but we have been regulating and successfully controlling particulate matter emissions for air quality and health reasons, not for climate reasons, and black carbon is a component of that. Black carbon, it's different from a greenhouse gas. It's an aerosol. It absorbs incoming sunlight, and that's how it has a warming effect. I'll talk about the differences with greenhouse gases. One of the key reasons why black carbon is being considered for a climate change strategy in the first place is not only because it appears to have a significant warming effect, but when you reduce emissions of black carbon, you can get essentially an immediate effect or possible benefit on the climate because it is short-lived in the atmosphere. And some significant climate science uncertainties remain, and we'll kind of talk about these. So next slide. So a little bit more about some of the key differences between black carbon and the greenhouse gases. First of all, like I mentioned, it's very short-lived in the atmosphere. So days to weeks is how long it may last in the atmosphere once it's emitted. Greenhouse gases, on the other hand, can last anywhere from decades to literally centuries. And this means that black carbon, unlike greenhouse gases, they are not well mixed in the atmosphere. So their concentrations will vary significantly over space and over time. Greenhouse gases are essentially uniformly mixed in the atmosphere when they're emitted. Black carbon can also affect precipitation rates because it can affect cloud formation. It can actually lead to what is referred to as dimming, surface dimming, because it's absorbing incoming sunlight, which means sometimes it blocks sunlight from reaching the surface. And it has the unique feature of darkening snow and ice. So it can change the reflectivity of snow and ice surfaces. So these are all things that you don't really have to worry about with greenhouse gases. And basically, it's a little more. There's more going on. It's more complicated than greenhouse gases. Also, there's no standard definition for black carbon. So, for example, when you read through the literature, sometimes people talk about black carbon, sometimes you see elemental carbon, sometimes you see soot, and there are people use different definitions, and this is part of the issue for black carbon, and this has been recognized as an issue, and people recognize that some kind of greater standardization would improve our understanding, especially when you compare one study to another. Some of the implications of these differences is one, when you reduce emissions of black carbon, you get a more immediate response with the climate, whereas with greenhouse gases, there's more of a lag time from emission reduction to climate effect. The effects are a little more uncertain, and this also means the location of black carbon mitigation measures matters a lot more in terms of climate effects versus greenhouse gases. So for greenhouse gases, you really don't have to worry about where the emission takes place, or and likewise where the mitigation activity takes place. But for black carbon, location is kind of everything, because that will determine the climate effect. Next slide. Okay. There are some. Could you click again? There's some words missing on the slide. Oh, there we go. This is IPCC's kind of classic bar chart showing the warming effects of different greenhouse gases and other aerosols. So the red bars are warming, the blue bars are cooling. CO2 is the top bar. It's the dominant anthropogenic warming agent in the atmosphere. And then further down, you have black carbon. So you see that black carbon, according to the IPCC estimate, does cause a significant warming effect at the global scale. And if you could just click again. But the complicating factor is that black carbon is co-emitted with things that cause cooling. So black carbon is always co-emitted with organic carbon, which essentially has the opposite effect, a cooling effect. And this black carbon to organic carbon ratio varies depending on the source. So diesel vehicles, for example, very rich in BC, little OC. So probably a good candidate for a climate strategy. Something like wildfires, biomass burning, huge source of black carbon, but you get lots of organic carbon with it. So as a climate mitigation strategy, probably a little more iffy. Next slide. Black carbon in the Arctic. This is receiving a huge amount of attention now. Should I get questions now, or do you want to wait? Black carbon is black carbon is more of a pure pure carbon substance. So it's the stuff that remains uncombusted. When you see blackish smoke coming out of an old bus, a lot of that is black carbon. Organic carbon has more stuff attached to it, like more hydrogen and other things like that, and it tends to be the whitish smoke you might see from campfire or something like that. When you see that whitish smoke, a lot of that, more of that is organic carbon. So hope that helps. Yeah.
Secondary organic carbon, and that's also whitish.
Yes.
So, and that's maybe part of this. It's all white.
Okay. So black carbon in the Arctic, like I said, because black carbon can deposit on snow and ice and darken the surface, this effect is causing an additional warming effect. And there's a lot of attention being focused on the Arctic now because the Arctic is warming more than any other place on the Earth. And there is work going on to investigate to what extent black carbon may be contributing to the very high rates of warming we see in the Arctic. The graph I'm showing you there is one study. It's not the final word, but it's one study that showed that if you look at how CO2 and black carbon are contributing to warming at the global scale versus just at the Arctic scale, according to this study, black carbon is having a much greater, almost disproportionate effect on warming in the Arctic versus at the global scale. And it's because of this kind of amplified snow and ice effect. Next slide. The same is true for other areas where there's a lot of snow and ice, a lot of snow and glacier dominated areas. For example, there's now some work going on looking at to what extent black carbon may be causing glacier melt in the Himalayas, and in fact some other glacier areas even within the U.S. Next slide. So at the global scale, where is all this black carbon coming from? So this is a pie chart for all global black carbon emissions. The yellow, the dominant chunk of the pie chart there is from biomass burning. So wildfires, prescribed fires, savanna burning in Africa, very, very large sources. The red there, and this is the piece of the pie Jacob will be talking a lot about later on. This is residential burning. So residential burning of different kinds of fuels, big source in developing countries. The gray piece of the pie down there is transportation sources, and within transportation, diesels. So both on-road and off-road diesel vehicles are the dominant transportation source. The blue chunk is industry. Industry tends to be a larger source in developing countries, not so much in the U.S. And you'll notice that there's almost no sliver for power generation. So power generation, huge contributor to greenhouse gases and most air pollutants we think of, but actually a very small, minuscule source of black carbon because the combustion is so efficient and there are already particulate traps, and so you don't get a lot of black carbon from that source. So just taking a more disaggregated look at this, this is showing how the portfolio of black carbon emissions varies from one region to the other. The main story is that for places like North America, Europe, industrialized countries, fossil fuels, again, primarily transportation, diesel vehicles, are the dominant sources of black carbon. Whereas in Africa, savanna burning and some forest fires are the dominant source. China, you also have a lot of transportation emissions, but a lot more from small industry. And in India and in Africa as well, residential burning are huge sources. So the story is that the portfolio of where the emissions are coming from varies a lot from one region to the other. Next slide. This is a breakdown of, this is a picture of U.S. emissions. And like I said, the gray area there is transportation, and but not an insignificant fraction, according to this, over 26% from biomass burning. In the U.S., that would be both wildfires, the kind we have out west, but also prescribed burning. A lot of prescribed burning in the U.S. happens, especially in the southeast with the forest industry. And out west. Next slide. This is an even further disaggregation of U.S. black carbon emissions. The top left splits out the transportation sector. There, the story is, on-road and off-road diesel vehicles are the dominant source. Gasoline vehicles do contribute some to black carbon, but they're much smaller source. And then the top right is a breakout of the biomass burning and there too, wildfires, prescribed burning are the big source. Okay, next slide. Just a word about one thing that EPA is working on right now. EPA is tasked with doing a report to Congress. This came from 2009 appropriations language. Our report is due in springtime of 2011. This is the language that guides the EPA report. So we're looking at the inventory of major sources, climate impacts, potential metrics, that is, what are the ways in which black carbon may be compared to the effects of greenhouse gases? What metric do you use, and what could be the appropriate metrics? What are cost-effective mitigation actions, and what are the climate and potential climate and public health benefits of mitigation actions? So really kind of a to Z report on black carbon. Okay, next slide. So some other ongoing activities. Actually, under the LRTAP convention, they set up a black carbon expert group to look at the possibility of including black carbon within that framework, which is a hemispheric agreement on air quality issues. It's not a climate agreement, but again, because black carbon is part of particulate matter, some people think that treaty may be an appropriate venue for looking at black carbon at the international, at least hemispheric scale. The so-called bounding report is a forthcoming science report. I actually think when this comes out, and hopefully it will come out possibly by the end of this calendar year, I think will be perhaps the most authoritative study done to date on state of the science on black carbon. There is also a UNEP assessment ongoing now on black carbon, also looking at science but also mitigation issues. There is also the work under the Arctic Council. There is actually an Arctic Council task force on short-lived climate forcers. I'm actually co-chairing that task force, and if I have any remaining time, I can tell you a little bit more about that. I'll stop there. Let's see the next slide. What am I doing on time, or should I? Okay, just a few more words about what is happening under the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council, some of you may or may not be familiar with it. It's a consortium of 8 countries: U.S., Canada, Russia, Iceland, the Scandinavian countries, and Denmark. We're in the Arctic Council because of Alaska. And it's not a legally binding treaty, but it's a consortium of these countries coming together and working to collaborate on a host of issues. It could range from environmental issues to actual search and rescue operations in the Arctic. And they established this task force. The main objective of the task force is to look into this issue, primarily on black carbon, but methane emissions and tropospheric ozone are also within our mandate, and to develop recommendations for the Arctic Council to consider. The next high-level meeting at the foreign minister level will happen in May of 2011, and our job is to tee up recommendations for the foreign ministers at that meeting to consider. And this just shows some of the work that is happening within the task force. So we're not a science body, so we are focusing on emissions and mitigation issues. And what we've been doing is we have been identifying the largest emission sources within the Arctic Council countries. Given what I just told you, there are kind of no surprises there. We are doing some work looking at the expected trends in those emissions with kind of business as usual policies. The story here, and actually the story for most industrialized countries, is that overall black carbon emissions over the near term are actually expected to come down. And that's And that's because of what is happening with particulate matter standards for diesel vehicles in the U.S. and other industrialized countries. So these particulate matter standards, even though they weren't designed to reduce black carbon for climate reasons, they are filtering out all of the particulates from coming out of the tailpipe. So black carbon emissions are expected to come down significantly over the next 10 to 20 years from transportation, but black carbon emissions from other sources may remain around the same in some other sources like agricultural burning, forest fires, residential burning. And that's kind of what this graph is showing. And maybe I'll end on this slide, but I'll also just say that the other key sources that the Arctic Council is kind of teeing up for consideration are residential burning, agricultural burning, and forest fires. These are big issues in Russia. So getting Russia to engage will be frankly will be our challenge in the Arctic Council. And also we're looking at shipping emissions because right now shipping overall is a pretty small source, but there is concern that with rates of ice melt occurring as they are, and if you continue to have rates of ice melt the way things have going, you're going to have greater and greater, more opening of ice-free passages for shipping. So it's projected that shipping emissions may actually increase as a result of this over time, and you're going to be releasing those emissions right where they have the most impact, so very close to the snow and ice. So there is concern about increasing shipping emissions over time. So maybe I'll stop there.
So there'll be an opportunity at the end, after all the presentations, to ask questions of our entire panel and to look specifically at the transportation sector and its contributions to black carbon. We now welcome Conrad Schneider, Advocacy Director for the Clean Air Task Force. Conrad. If you'd like to do your own.
Oh, great, thank you. Well, good morning. My name is Conrad Schneider. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Clean Air Task Force. We're a environmental advocacy NGO based in Boston, but with national and international presence. And I wanted to thank EESI for inviting us today to talk a little bit about one of the sectors that you just heard about, the transportation sector, in particular on diesel. And in my 10 minutes, I'm going to run you through just a few hundred slides here about diesel. So let's jump in, and I'll be happy to take your questions at the end. So first of all, why should we? And this, I wanted to commend EESI actually for styling this session, implications for climate change and public health, because it's we look at diesel cleanup as really being a twofer and a no-regret strategy with respect to both of those issues. So if we could go to the next, and I guess I can do this myself. So one of the things about diesel is it's an issue that cuts across a lot of different things, including health and climate. But it's an air toxic. There's a global warming dimension that we just talked about. As an air toxic, it's also an important thing for children's health with respect to school buses and proximity to schools. It's an environmental justice issue, whether it's domestically or internationally, because of the location and the people who are most exposed to the issue. It's a worker safety issue. If you're operating the equipment that's using, or the vehicles that are using diesel, the toxic fumes can be important there. In fact, most of the studies that have been done about diesel health effects have happened in occupational settings. It's a commuter issue, which means it's an issue for almost all of us, although probably only about 5 to 6% of our day is spent commuting. Over 60% of our daily exposure to particulate matter comes from our commute. So diesel is an important issue there. And then from an economic development standpoint, cleaning it up is a jobs creator. So there are a lot of different reasons to care about diesel, and a lot of different ways to hook into this issue. So the first is that diesel is hazardous, and these are just a few You mentioned of a few of the studies that looked at both particulate matter in general and diesel particulate matter specifically. The studies are legion, that this is a hazardous air pollutant. And in fact, EPA keeps track of a certain number of hazardous air pollutants, and when you look at the comparative or relative risks of them compared to each other, diesel particulate matter poses 7 times the lung cancer risk of all of the air toxics that EPA tracks combined. So this is the big one. Diesel particulate matter is sort of a witch's brew of a lot of air toxics, because the little, and this is just a very crude diagram, but what you have with this sort of black carbon or elemental carbon core is a lot of other air toxics that go along for a ride. When they interact with your body, you're not just getting the black carbon, but you're getting all the other toxic bad stuff as well. And this is just a very simple schematic about how diesel particulate enters your body. It's respiratory, but because the particles are so small, they actually make it through the air-blood exchange in your lungs, and it's thought that many of the health effects are cardiovascular. That is, particulate matter exposure can lead to heart attacks and other inflammation that causes heart attacks and other cardio problems as well. We know that there's kind of a linear dose-response relationship between particulate matter and these health effects, so there really is no safe level. But the good news is that studies that have documented the decline in particularly diesel-related and other particulate emissions have shown that mortality has been reduced over time as a result of that cleanup. Today, where we are domestically here in the U.S. is that diesel emissions cause about 21,000 premature deaths per year, and that compares to a number of other causes of death as a result of many of the power plant emission reductions that have happened over the last just decade. For the first time, diesel emissions are actually higher relative to power plant emissions. So they're the #1 pollution source with respect to mortality risk currently. So the second reason we care about black carbon, and I'm using the terms almost interchangeably in terms of diesel particulate matter and black carbon, because as you heard from Ben's presentation, that's appropriate. The climate impacts are potent. Ben didn't get into this as much because they're in the middle of, the EPA is in the middle of doing a study about the metrics, but at least by some accounts, black carbon is about 2,000 times more potent than an equivalent amount of CO2 over a 20-year period. As you heard, the biggest source in the U.S. is diesel. Reducing diesel particulate matter and black carbon is a no-regret strategy because, #1, it's a big health benefit, but because, #2, the elemental carbon to organic carbon ratio, as you heard, is favorable with respect to climate benefits for diesel. At least there doesn't seem to be any real residual doubt about that. And obviously the health code benefits, and because the benefits are also immediate. If you reduce or eliminate black carbon source, such as diesel, where there's no regrets, you see almost an immediate cooling benefit in the atmosphere. And I'm not going to really get into this. Ben did a great job of describing the different ways in which black carbon impacts the climate. I'm going to just pause for a second on the pie charts. Depending on the year that you're looking at, they're fairly well comparable to the ones that Ben used. I would just point out that these are mass-based pie charts, and there's still, I guess, some residual uncertainty around whether mass or particle number is most important with respect to climate impacts. That's actually true for health impacts, too. There's some emerging science that suggests that particle number may be quite important with respect to health impacts, and that is to say not just the mass or the weight of the particle, but how many particles there are. And the way that might have a climate impact would include, #1, the surface area. If number mattered more than mass, the surface area in terms of the impact of warming might be greater. The second way it might matter is dispersion. That is to say, lighter, smaller particles might disperse more over a region, and therefore, affect its warming differently. And then lastly, lighter particles, smaller, lighter particles, probably stay aloft longer. So there might be a little bit more warming entailed there. But that, as I said, is an area of uncertainty. If those things were true, you'd have to rebalance these pie charts. And what that might mean, because diesel tends toward the smaller end of the spectrum, might mean that diesel is even more important as a contributor to warming, and I guess health too, than you see represented by these mass-based pie charts. The good news is we have a solution to this problem. Unlike so many other environmental problems, this is not rocket science, it's auto mechanics. There is a diesel particulate filter, a device called a diesel particulate filter that can remove 90% of these particles from tailpipe exhaust. And that's a huge benefit with respect to both health and climate. As you can imagine, for every $12, for every dollar spent cleaning up or installing particulate filters, you get $12 of health benefit. Those are calculations that have been done with respect to the Diesel Emission Reduction Act, which I'll talk about just in a minute. But for climate, the diesel particulate filter is the only device that virtually eliminates black carbon from the exhaust. It literally physically traps the particle, okay, and removes it at a 90% efficiency rate. And because it's one of the actions that will have immediate climate benefits, that just gives you a big, sort of immediate, significant climate benefit. And we've calculated, for example, that replacing or retrofitting a fleet of about 1 million trucks in the U.S. would deliver this equivalent climate benefit of eliminating 21 million cars from the road. Now, an important note is that these diesel particulate filters require ultra-low, very low levels of sulfur in the fuel to be able to operate over time. And that ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel is available in the U.S., but it's not available everywhere in the world. It's available in the U.S. Because the EPA required, as part of the new engine standards for on and off road that were issued over the last 10 years, that fuel be available. And the new engine standards are what's driving what Ben talked about, which is over time, the next few decades, as the fleet turns over from older, dirtier engines to newer, cleaner ones, over time there'll be an improvement as a result, because in essence, these diesel particulate filters are being required on new engines. And this is just an example of some testing that we did demonstrating that these diesel particulate filters, or DPFs, virtually eliminate the problem. On the left-hand side, you see we're tracking a truck behind a truck without a filter, and that's the particle levels in the sort of purple line. And then the same truck the next day, after we retrofit it with a diesel particulate filter, the particles were virtually gone. We couldn't pick them up. And these are the levels inside the cabin of the car that's trailing that truck. So the left-hand side is what you're breathing if you're following a truck. So the way we look at it, clean up diesel is a win for health, climate, and jobs. And this is just a schematic of the supply chain and the states that are involved in actually producing and installing all the different parts of the supply chain for diesel particulate filters for new manufactured engines and vehicles, and also for retrofits. So there's a big win here for jobs as well. Now, for those of you who are involved in writing policy, thinking about how to promote this or think about it, there are a variety of different conceptual options, and I'm going to talk about some specifics. Mandates. It's pretty simple. California has a diesel risk reduction program that's based around mandates. It sets emission standards for these engines. And EPA, and it applies to both new and existing engines, although those standards are in flux right now because of the politics in California. EPA has new engine standards that I referenced, but they only apply, obviously, to new engines. Contract specifications, which are not mandates, but if you're doing business with the government could specify that the engines that are being used on public works projects or contracts and so forth could have to have clean diesel. And New York's Diesel Emission Reduction Act has this. There's an executive order in Illinois. Actually, there's an ordinance in Cook County and in Chicago around this too. Rhode Island and Providence, Rhode Island, and the state of Rhode Island recently passed legislation. There are other examples in which if you're contracting to do a public works contract, that you have to have, say, a diesel particulate filter or low sulfur diesel or whatever on the equipment that's working on it. So it's a specification. Funding or incentives is another way. The Diesel Emission Reduction Act, which is up for reauthorization, provides money, $1 billion, at least it's authorized at $1 billion over 5 years, the last 5 years, to provide money for this. In California, there's a Carl Moyer program. In Texas, the Texas Emission Reduction Program, or TERP. And there are other ideas, tax incentives, scrappage incentives, and so forth that come into this category. And lastly, there's a voluntary program that EPA has been running for the last few years, last 10 years actually, the EPA Clean Diesel program. Now, let's pause on some immediate federal opportunities for cleaning up diesel. The first and foremost is the reauthorization of the Diesel Emission Reduction Act. It's expiring this year. There's an effort to actually try to reauthorize it in the lame duck session. In the Senate, that effort is being led by Senators Carper and Voinovich. If you're a Senate staffer and your boss would like to participate in this, it's not too late to co-sponsor that effort. If you're interested, contact Laura Haynes in Senator Carper's office. The Diesel Emission Reduction Act, as I said, is basically a $1 billion 5-year program, $200 million a year in theory at the authorized level to help to provide grants and loans and rebates and so forth to provide the money to clean up these, to provide filters or repowerings or rebuilding engines and so forth, different strategies that are available to help reduce diesel particulate and black carbon. The second idea up here, and I would say also on the House side, there's an effort to try to coordinate this so it could easily move in a lame duck session. It's not clear that it'll make over the finish line in something like that, but we certainly want to tee it up during that time, and if not, come back early next session. This is a bill that has had, for a long time, has had bipartisan support both in authorization and appropriations, so it has hopefully has an opportunity to move. The second one here, as Al mentioned, is called Credit for Clunkers. It is a program that's being developed in conjunction with DOT private activity bonds, which were issued under Safety Lou, the last transportation bill. They will persist. There's about $9 billion worth of tax-free bonding authority still there to be used, and it can be accessed. The Safety Lou had a language that said it could be used for diesel emission reduction. It's a little complicated, but basically the idea is to offer low-interest loans to truckers who would like to upgrade their trucks or buy newer, cleaner trucks with a lower interest loan. And I can talk about that more if we have questions. Clean diesel and the transportation bill reauthorization. Nobody knows whether the transportation bill is going to move in the next 2 years. There's some indication that there would be some support for that. Our position, consistent with the idea of contract specifications, is that new federal infrastructure should be built with clean diesel, and that it should be required and paid for through the transportation bill. We've actually negotiated a set of principles with the Association of General Contractors, the people who own the heavy equipment that would be used on these projects, and they agree that as long as it's funded and it can be required, and we could do a lot to clean up construction equipment that would be used on federal transportation infrastructure projects. The second idea up there is the idea of a holiday or a rollback of the federal excise tax on new engine purchases. Right now, if you want to go out and buy a truck, and the idea here is to turn the fleet over into newer, cleaner, faster, you're going to face a 12% federal excise tax. Well, if we could drop the price of a truck by 12% or 6%, that might stimulate more purchases of trucks, more newer, cleaner trucks, and flip the fleet faster. That would be a huge benefit in terms of particulate and black carbon reduction. So that's an issue that we've put forward with respect to the transportation bill reauthorization. And lastly, as been mentioned, EPA is doing a study on this, and we're anxiously awaiting the results of that, and implementation of those recommendations could be another federal strategy. And then let me just touch very briefly and conclude on international opportunities for diesel cleanup. Now let me just walk you through this, sort of carefully. Basically, as I said, the United States adopted new engine standards, both for off-road and on-road diesels. Well, the European Union has done the same thing, and their standards are called Euro standards. Euro 3, 4, 5, 6 have different levels of stringency. And globally, typically, other countries will adopt the Euro standards as opposed to the U.S. standards. They're really not very different, but it's expressed here in terms of the Euro standards. An internationally recognized transportation expert, Michael Walsh, who works with the International Council on Clean Transportation, developed an analysis that showed that if China and India and Brazil adopted the Euro 6 standards, those standards for particulate matter emissions that are comparable or equivalent to our standards, just that alone, plus adopting some lesser standards in the rest of the world, and with the new standards that we've already adopted in the U.S. and the EU, could achieve an additional 38 billion carbon equivalent tons by 2050. Now, that's a big number. What does that number mean? Let's put it into some relief. Just let me ask you, are you all, show of hands, how many people are aware of the climate mitigation wedges analysis that Princeton has done? Okay, so maybe half the room. Let me just, this is I won't spend a lot of time discussing it, but let me just say that to be able to achieve climate mitigation by 2050, the Carbon Mitigation Initiative at Princeton has figured out, that you need sort of 8 of these wedges to get there. They involve all kinds of different climate mitigation strategies. The point behind this slide is that if China, India, Brazil adopted the Euro 6 standards, we could get 1 to 2 wedges by itself, which is enormous. It's an enormous potential benefit from that type of thing. Now, it would take time, because it would take time for their fleets to turn over and grow. And, of course, this is a 2050 metric. But that would be a huge improvement. The big challenge there, however, is, and this is a map that shows where low sulfur fuel is located today, is that in China, India, and Brazil, it doesn't exist today. So they would have to make the change to ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel or very low sulfur diesel fuel, and then adopt the standards, or as part of that, adopt the standards and implement it. But that would be probably the biggest immediate international opportunity with respect to reducing black carbon. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to questions afterwards.
And finally, to look into the residential burning, the contributions of that sector to black carbon, and to bring us into the world of clean cook stoves, we have Jacob Muss, Senior Advisor in the Office of Air and Radiation for the EPA, and also serving as an informal technical advisor to the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. Jacob.
Thanks very much, Laura. Let me rip through these slides pretty quickly. It's a pretty basic issue, I think. Not many people know about it, but it's not rocket science, as someone said. It's more the fact that we're in the 21st century, and half the world is still cooking and heating their homes with incredibly crude stoves, open fires, or really crude structures, burning wood, dung, coal, charcoal, crop residues, in some cases toxic materials themselves to service a basic human need of having a healthy meal every single day. So it's mostly developing world, as you can see, in South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then pockets of Latin America. Is an overall part of the inventory. Latin America isn't as huge a deal, but where these fuels are used, it's a very big deal. So it's not in the urban areas, but more in the rural areas. And note as well over here, this sort of note that I put at the bottom of this map, that IEA estimates that 200 million more people are going to be using biomass alone, let alone coal, by 2030. So it's not something that's going to go away. This is a problem. It's awful, and it's getting worse. Let's talk about the public health. We tend to focus in these kinds of briefings more on climate, but what motivates us mostly on this issue for cook stoves is public health. If you look in poor developing countries around the world, it is the 4th worst health risk factor in the world and leads to about 1.5 to 2 million deaths per year. Think about that, 2 million deaths per year. That's about 1 every 20 seconds. In the course of this briefing, do the math, 180 minutes times 3, what is it, 540 people will die in the course of this briefing. It's insane. And as I say, it's mostly women and very young children that are dying from this. Little perspective on air quality. EPA standard, our daily standard is actually 35 micrograms per cubic meter just for PM 2.5. But for something that's suffered every single day, the more relevant comparison is our annual standard, which is 15 micrograms per cubic meter. Here's Chicago on a clean day. You can see the PM 2.5 levels. I think we're about 6 to 8 micrograms per cubic meter that day. 10 days later, 34 micrograms per cubic meter. Note that still meets our 24-hour standard, but would be more than twice the annual standard. You can see a huge amount of obfuscation here, but think about it, the scale of it. This is the scale of a cityscape. You're walking down on the street with someone next to you. You can still see them without any impairment. We're talking about skylines and city lines, as opposed to over here in the kitchen in Guatemala. This is on the order of feet, meters, where you can't even see the woman who's cooking in there. The levels are so high. That peak exposure there was about over 8,000 micrograms per cubic meter. A more typical concentration would range anywhere from hundreds to low hundreds to a few thousand micrograms per cubic meter. And that's just PM. The smoke also contains all sorts of toxics, known human carcinogens, a whole range of climate forcers, not just black carbon, inorganic carbon. And then if coal is the fuel, it's a whole slew of other things that are included that lead to a whole different set of health impacts. Little perspective on where things are going. So deaths per year attributed to this. This is a conservative figure from several different sources, but it's called 1.5 million deaths per year from biomass smoke. Today, that's more than twice, I think, for malaria, more than tuberculosis. And if you took the upper end, 2 million deaths per year, it'd be about on par with the number of people who die every year from HIV/AIDS. Where's this going to go? You can see all three of those are expected to drop dramatically in the next 20 years. As opposed to cook stoves, more people are going to be using this, the exposures are going up, and more people are expected to die. This is the exact opposite trend that we want to see, and we're doing everything we can to change that right now. It's not just an immediate public health issue. There are a whole slew of other impacts from the use of solid fuels for cooking. One is the time lost to women and children. They have to go, in some cases, hours every single day or several times a week to collect fuel. That keeps women from engaging in more productive economic activity, and it keeps kids out of school. In refugee camps and conflict zones, women and girls face the added and, I would say, insanely awful added risk of personal violence. They go out, they collect the fuel, they're attacked, they're raped. In some cases, I heard a stat recently that in certain parts of the Congo, it's a good time if a woman goes out 2 weeks and isn't attacked. I mean, this is crazy stuff. It also contributes to deforestation and habitat loss in certain areas. It's all a function of how the biomass is collected. Are you cutting down trees? Are you just collecting dead wood? So we generally don't say that it contributes categorically to these issues, but where it is an issue, it's an important one and can drive a lot of the interest in it. In terms of climate, there's two interests in terms of climate and cook stoves. The first has to do with greenhouse gases. So you can see here a typical cook stove will reduce fuel use, leading to about anywhere from about 1/2 ton to 2 tons of CO2 per year. That can actually be much higher if you're starting out with coal fuel and you're going to renewable biomass. It's an incredibly powerful tool in terms of transforming the sort of dynamic on cook stoves from one of donors where you give away money and hope for results to a financial transaction. You get benefits, you get paid for that, and you only get paid for it if you get the benefits. So that's a really cool thing. It also demands extensive monitoring, and because the transaction costs are so high to start this kind of a program, it incentivizes both very large projects and the continued use of the stove, so you continue to get the benefits, which is really good. The key limitation, and particularly in terms of this briefing, is that the fuel use benefits between, and I have some up here, I'll show you other pictures, but the fuel use benefits between a sort of intermediate stove and a really advanced stove are, they exist, but they're not huge. You're not going to get a massive fuel use savings. And because the key metric for carbon financing in cook stoves is fuel use, it won't on its own provide an incentive to get to the super clean stoves. And you'll see that has a powerful implication in terms of black carbon. I'm not going to go through all these things. Ben's mentioned all this. The main point here is that cook stoves represent somewhere between 18 and 25, 26% of the global inventory of black carbon emissions. So let's look at the potential to reduce black carbon from cook stoves. Here's a traditional stove, 3-stone fire. And about, I think for diesel, it's about 70%, 50 to 70% of the fine particles is black carbon. For cook stoves, it's less. It's about 25%. And it varies substantially by the fuel quality, by the person who's tending the fire and how they put the fuel in. But in general, you can say about 25%. Here's some basic improved wood stoves. I brought one of them with me here today. They will reduce fine particles by about 50% in the lab. But keep in mind that these weren't designed to reduce black carbon, and they weren't. So we haven't done extensive measurements right now on black carbon reductions. EPA actually just completed a suite of testing of these in other stoves, but we haven't analyzed the data yet, so we should have that in a couple months. But preliminary data from us and from other sources indicates that there's probably not a huge benefit in terms of black carbon reductions from these stoves in the field or in the lab. But they weren't designed for that, so it's not really criticism or just a statement of fact. Next sort of step up in solutions would be processing solid fuels, so that if you can only use solid fuels, let's make sure they're burned and combusted as cleanly as possible by use of charcoal or pellets or biomass cakes. All sorts of folks around the world doing this in different ways. And if you use those in an advanced stove, and here's three different pictures, and again, I brought the Philips stove right here. I brought with me today, so you can take a look at that. But these are all stoves that have some form of electricity associated with them. You can do it through a battery, through a thermoelectric device, or through plugging it into the wall. But when you get that, you can drive a fan, and when you drive the fan into the combustion chamber, you're mixing the combustion byproducts, and you recombust them in some sense, and you can drive down the emissions by 90 to 95%. So this is essentially where we want to be in terms of using solid fuels, get processed solid fuels into these stoves and combusted as cleanly as possible. Where you really want to be overall is getting people on clean fuels, because that's going to be by far the cleanest solution. So here's a picture of just LPG canisters. This is essentially what you would use in your backyard here in the States if you have a gas grill in your backyard. And then this is biogas, which is probably from a sort of net climate and emissions perspective the cleanest fuel out there. We often say that the field of cook stoves is approaching a tipping point for a whole host of reasons. We've gotten much more confident on the health benefits of getting improved stoves in people's homes. There's a study in Guatemala that's still hoping to publish the results, but they've essentially showed that if you get a substantial reduction in human exposure, measured human exposure through randomized control trial, you can achieve substantial reductions in childhood pneumonia, which is the main source of the mortality from young kids that we're able to quantify today. We're talking about all the climate impacts today that are bringing all sorts of new interest into the field. We've got a whole new slew of stove designs that weren't on the market 3 or 4 years ago that are now being sold at a significant scale, and several more that are even better that are in the pipeline, and we'll be able to plug into the distribution channels for these stoves. And whole variety of different business models from, here's a production facility in China that exports around the world. This is a place in Guatemala that exports to several different countries in Latin America. And this is a vendor in Cambodia that uses a totally different model of having one set design that then different manufacturers make around a common design, and they build all sorts of job creation locally. And it's a charcoal stove, so it's a more simple stove, but it's a great business model. And then we're getting a lot more rigorous on the testing and evaluation of stoves. The fact that we've got testing data now, EPA's done a second round of testing. We've got different labs around the world that are doing this in a substantial way, is an indicator that we're not just sort of taking people's statements from whatever they want to say that this is an improved stove. We now have interim benchmarks, and we're going to be establishing global standards as to what a clean stove is, and then monitoring the progress to meet those over time. And there's a whole new slew of activity in the field, some of which I'll get into a little bit more later. But the government of India, the United Nations Foundation has just launched a global alliance for clean cook stoves that the U.S. government is part of, Shell Foundation, and many others as well. Let's talk about scale, because the point of black carbon is to get near-term climate benefits, but you're not going to do that if you're only dealing with a few stoves. We're talking about a global market size of 500 to 700 million households. In regions like Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, China, and India, we're talking about hundreds of millions of homes. The current state of activity is that we're only getting to probably singles of millions of stoves per year of varying qualities. Some will be good, some won't. Some will have an impact on black carbon, some won't. And for the advanced stoves that really will get to the heart of the problem, well under a million sales per year. So, well under 1% of 500 million would be 5 million. We're well under that in terms of the stoves that are actually going to deal with this now. So the point being, if we want to have a significant impact on both the burden of disease, the health impacts, as well as the net black carbon impacts on the globe, we're going to need to scale this up in a really, really massive way. This is a visual from Ramanathan and Carmichael's study a couple of years ago. Shows that, if you were to eliminate smoke from cook stoves in South Asia and East Asia, you could have a substantial and immediate effect on the black carbon warming, But again, that's 100% implementation overnight. That's the essence of that model. So to do that is a big deal. Let's not be naive about how easy this is. EPA has been involved in this field for about 8 years now. We started something called the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air in 2002. It's got over 400 partners now. You can see the blue bars here. The results of the partners have been doubling about every 2 years. But the big thing in terms of the scale is, as of 2 years ago, they were only, at least the ones that were reporting to us, were only telling us results around the scale of 800,000 homes per year. That's doubling. That's growing very rapidly, but it's still under 1 million per year. So that's why we're so excited that the UN Foundation has led the process to launch this Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves. We just launched it at the Clinton Global Initiative at the end of September with several, about 20 different founding partners. You can see the mission and the vision is universal adoption of clean and efficient cooking solutions, and an interim milestone of, by 2020, reaching 100 million homes. That would be 20% of the market. Still not 100%, still not where we need to be, but a huge leap forward. This I did not put in your pack because it's not quite ready for prime time, but it sort of shows you, in essence, what the Alliance, some version of what the Alliance will be trying to do. Champion the sector in a global context, raise awareness of it, do the diplomacy and the policy around it, but also working with the manufacturers to develop markets, doing the applied research that's necessary still, and then working with governments that are interested in this work, as well as humanitarian support in refugee camps and conflict settings, to build the stoves and fuels industry, and then eventually achieve this goal of universal adoption of clean and efficient cooking solutions. Summary. Cook stoves are a huge part of the inventory. They're a controllable part of the inventory. We know enough now to realistically go after this at a huge scale, but it's not. This is a good time to do that, but it's going to require a huge investment and a huge amount of effort. It's not going to be a simple task. And the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves that the UN Foundation has led the launch of, I think, is absolutely the vehicle to make this happen. There are several folks here from UN Foundation, including, I don't see her right now, but oh, there she is, Leslie Cortez, who's running the Global Alliance, is in the back of the room, so we can talk with her later as well. Key message, it's enormous win-win from a climate perspective, but also from a developing countries' perspective. They may be less interested in the climate benefits and more in the health, the lives saved, the livelihood benefits, the economic development. And then finally, a key caution on message is let's not blame climate change on women cooking food in developing countries. That's obviously a patently absurd statement, but it can be portrayed that way sometimes. Here's an article, front page article, above the fold, front page New York Times, about 16 months ago, or a year and a half ago now, in the New York Times, that talked about cook stoves and black carbon. The very next day, Jay Leno says, climate experts we should tell villagers in developing countries to reduce the amount of cooking smoke they generate to help fix global warming. It's as if these people don't hate us enough already. I mean, they live in mud huts, they have thatched roofs, their clothes are made of straw. We pull up in a bunch of Humvees and SUVs going, say, hey, get rid of the smoke, or get the smoke out of here. It's like it's a real issue. We have to be very careful about the messaging here. And if we screw it up, it'll come off as blaming developing countries, and women in particular, who are just trying to feed their families for climate change. And we've got to be very, very careful about that. That's it.
Thank you very much to all three of you for very clear and compelling presentations. And at this point, we will go ahead and open it up for questions. And if you'll just identify yourself and speak loudly.
I wanted to ask you if there's any science coming out, because that would give some clarity on emissions of black carbon versus other particulates when you burn biomass that are supposed to mitigate climate change, global warming. And it's like, how much do these other particulates reduce global warming, and how much does black carbon increase it? If there's some science out there that still needs to be resolved.
That's right. The one study that I mentioned, they were being referred to as the bounding report. It's being called that because the scientists are trying to bound what the uncertainties are with black carbon. And I think this report will do exactly what you're asking. That I think it's breaking down the issue in a more detailed way than has ever been done to date. So this report is looking at both the direct warming effects of black carbon, but also the potential offsetting cooling effects of the co-emissions, plus the snow effects, plus the cloud effects that result from both black carbon and the co-emitted species. And they're looking at this by sector. So how does this net warming versus cooling picture change if you're talking about diesels versus residential burning versus open fires, forest fires? So this forthcoming study is doing exactly that, and I'm hoping that it's not going to answer every single question definitively, but I do think it will be the most authoritative look at all of this.
Let me add something to that, which is simply that we're talking about public health and climate. Organic carbon is terrible for your health. No one's saying that we shouldn't be going after these emissions reductions simply because of the organic carbon. The broader question that you're really getting at is it a climate driver or is it just purely a public health driver? But all particulate matter, all fine particles are terrible for your health, and we should be striving to reduce them in any case for public health reasons. Whether or not that's a climate benefit and how we characterize that is another question.
Just a little code on that too. With respect to diesel, particularly internationally, I mentioned that in order to use the diesel particulate filters, you need to have ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel. Reducing that sulfur is works the other way, right? So the warmer it's cooler. So there's been some studies that looked at what the trade-off would be there and found that while it does move in the direction, the order of magnitude is much smaller, so you still have a net benefit. And in fact, even some of the authors who worked on the Downing study looked at the cloud impacts of Downing diesel is directionally correct with respect to it. So it maybe have a little bit of a advantage with respect to the climate impacts and just being favored of strategy there. It appears that directionally it nets out in climate beneficial.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Gordon Boyle with the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. Ben, I wonder if you could talk about the steps the study is doing addressing legal authorities EPA has for reducing black carbon emissions. You talked about PM 2.5, but as Jacob noticed, some of the cleaners would study reduce PM 2.5 and within reduce black carbon. So is EPA looking into what legal authorities you have for reducing black carbon outside of just reducing PM 2.5?
We will be looking at clarifying all the existing programs that EPA does and where they derive their authority. I don't know, frankly, right now to what extent we'll get into additional legal issues under the Clean Air Act about whether or not EPA would require additional legal authority under the Clean Air Act in order to go after black carbon, because you can address black carbon with current particulate matter authority under the Clean Air Act. So not a word. And so frankly, I'm not exactly sure if we're going to address that, the kind of legal question you're asking.
Okay, I hope you will. Maybe bring it back to your group and work with it.
I very much second that. I hope you will.
Sir.
I have a question to the panel, the entire panel here. I did support the question of the code pollutants and the relevant effect. I would assume the boundary study will likely show some substantial differences depending on the area of force, for example, if you're talking about tourism and burning, the effects that this might have on any glaciers, the Arctic, or let's say the Antarctic Peninsula, and so on. Sometimes because the albedo effects the direction could shift quite dramatically, and even though there might be a lot of argument, we presume that there's the possibility that you're pointing a very large radius portion. In fact, is that your impression? Is that they looked at closely in this planning study?
So far, the bounding study is primarily focusing at the global scale. Even though the regional story of black carbon is tremendously important, it's taking a huge amount of effort to tell the comprehensive story at the global scale. So, frankly, there may be some immediate follow-ups to look at some regional issues. With that said, I do think the emerging story is a regional story of black carbon. That, like Jacob said, for health reasons, it's always a good thing, reducing black carbon, regardless of the mix of black carbon versus organic carbon. For climate, I think the emerging story is location does matter. So there may be kind of regional hotspots where it makes no sense from a climate perspective. And within the Arctic Council, there's also some work going on there to look at, to what extent different countries near the Arctic versus farther away from the Arctic are having an impact on Arctic warming, and how that Arctic warming may differ not only by location but also by source. Because one interesting twist about the Arctic is that normally the climate benefit of reducing black carbon emissions from open biomass sources looks iffy because there's so much associated with organic carbon. But if you're near the Arctic, you're already under a reflected surface. So cooling normally associated with organic carbon may not matter over the Arctic. So what would normally be maybe a net wash may be net warming over the Arctic. So within the Arctic, I think we're definitely trying to focus on a regional story, but I don't know if the bounding study will be completely satisfying region by region.
Say anything about the obstacles to rare adoption of ETFs, as the cost of retrofit, the cost of the alternative fuel?
Right. I would say the alternative fuel is not really an issue domestically. It's here. The biggest obstacle is to adopt, and I would say with respect to new engines, we're over the hump. I mean, new engines have ETFs. There have been basically good reports in terms of functionality and so forth. So it's the usual stuff, but it's political will, it's money, it's can you push mandates, and this political environment. Those are sort of real obstacles to greater penetration because, for example, fleet turnover that we expected, that they expected from its new engine standards hasn't occurred because of the recession. It is not as much goods movement as there otherwise would be. So vehicle miles traveled for diesel is down. Construction industry, I mean, it's hurting, so that means its activity level down means they're not turning over their fleets as fast as they would have thought. So the benefits that EPA projected that would happen as a result of their new engine standards haven't materialized as fast as they anticipated. So there's not an obstacle to that except for the fleets aren't turning over faster. So the policy challenge is how to make up that, how to flip the fleets faster. Are there incentives and ways to do that? With respect to retrofits, there's not to the owner of the piece of equipment or the owner of the engine, there's really not a benefit. There's not a fuel economy benefit. This is a public good. It's taking pollution out of the air. It improves public health. It improves the climate. But it doesn't inure to the benefit of the owner. So in that type of situation, overcome that obstacle, either have to help them pay for this, or you require it, either through emission standards California has done, or a combination of the two. And both of those policies are difficult. and there's not a lot of public money to spread around, and it's difficult to require private firms to take on a new mandate that would cost them money in this economic. So I would identify those as the primary challenges. Those are good challenges. There are some, as I mentioned, some domestic policies that could help to both flip the fleet and to fund retrofits. They're probably not up to the job in terms of the magnitude of the problem, but I think we need to make it start. And every bit we do now is going to help. It's going to also make up the ground that we've lost as a result of the sessions.
Hi, Chris Aquera from the Federal Aviation Administration. Is this bounding study going to go over an assessment of today's modeling techniques for climate, especially the sort of indirect effects like black carbon particles on snow and so on? We can really assess what are today's models, how we want to use, what are the techniques, and at what scales are those appropriate to use?
I think the short answer is yes. That the boundary report includes it's a number of really the scientists looking at this. There's a number of over a dozen or more people involved in the U.S. and other countries, and so there will be a lot of comparative modeling that will be in the report, and looking at the different ways in which different climate models represent black carbon and how they are treating all of the various effects, direct, indirect clouds, and the snail effects. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
In the red shirt.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Bella, QI's for Green Heat, and you're mentioning residential burning. I was wondering if your data and your recommendations are differentiating between dirty appliances like wood stoves, ancient wood stoves and fireplaces, and modern clean pellet stoves in the U.S.?
EPA has a program on modern wood stoves in the U.S. I don't work on it very much at all. When you have a modern pellet stove in the U.S., it's going to cost, first of all, it costs about $1,500. You have to pay for the pellets as well. It tends to be insanely clean. You're metering in the fuel as you go along, and the emission, the combustion is not as clean, as complete as you're going to get. And so it's a completely different beast than cooking on even an improved stove here. So we actually are in this Black Carbon Report to Congress doing a summary looking at residential heating in the developing world, where in parts of Canada and the Arctic and Scandinavia where these kinds of stoves are still used in a substantial way. And completely separate discussion, same chapter, different section on looking at cook stoves and development.
Right next door. Sir.
Yeah, I'm Michael Vinsky, World Bank. The thing that drives international policy most strongly is the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and the associated UN conventions around that. Do you foresee a significant change in the IPCC approach and measurements of black carbon in the next report?
I think it's fair to say that the next IPCC assessment will have much more information about this topic, about black carbon and the other aerosols. Key reason why we're talking about this bounding report coming out now is because the scientists recognize that the last IPCC assessment did an okay job, they did not do a great job on this, quite frankly, because it just wasn't getting as much attention as it is now. So this group of scientists are in the interim between IPCC assessments, putting their own assessment out there. And then I think any results from this boundary report and the other new science can then, of course, get picked up and reflected in the next IPCC assessment.
Tyler Chapman from Development Alternatives. Jacob, I was interested in your optimism for carbon credits. We've seen very little action domestically and internationally. The most finance coming for programmatic development mechanism projects like the Kyoto Protocol will either dry up at the end of 2012 or be extended in some way under the European Union. What is your main target in terms of, where do you see the optimism in carbon credits continuing beyond the next 2 years that are going to drive these large programs for high efficiency?
Most of what's happening right now in voluntary markets. It's not happening in the CDM markets. So that's where I think it's probably going to continue unless something else, as you say, in the process. So the optimism is less on what will happen after Kyoto and more on what it could help lead to the Cookstove industry process. A lot of people are very interested in continuing to tap these markets, the voluntary markets in particular. And one thing we considered is developing a sort of a massive revolving loan to facilitate the development of carbon financing, probably through most of the voluntary markets in this field. Huge transaction costs. It's a lot of distributed sources. It's very labor intensive, very transaction intensive. So that's the context I was thinking.
All the way in the back.
We certainly agree with Conrad's points that one way of using soot like vehicles. That said, as Conrad also said, a lot of new vehicles are very, very clean, and we see this new technology out of 4 or 5 years having that filtered through. So all that said, my question is kind of what we've been in that most of the graphs that are up there are all dated 2005, 2006, which are pre-ULSD in the United States, pre all this new technology coming in, and I'm wondering, what if any efforts are underway to redo that inventory, because it does not reflect any of the changes that have gone on in the vehicles, which are significant commercial conditions.
I did show one future projection. You're right. A lot of especially the global inventory numbers always lag behind U.S. domestic inventory numbers because it just takes a long time to gather all that data. But actually, there is a fair amount of work out now and looking at future projections, and all of these future projections are reflecting the new standards that are in place now. And in every case, the projection is that black carbon emissions from the U.S. and from all these other countries that have implemented the standards, that emissions are projected to decrease. And that I think is part of the story. The trends here are going down. Trends in other parts of the world, especially Asia, Africa, look to be going up precisely because, one, their miles traveled are increasing, and they don't have these standards in place yet. So, and even in the forthcoming IPCC, where they do the long-term projections, similar story. You see black carbon. You see the trends differ from industrialized versus developing countries, and then over the long term, most of the models assume black carbon eventually comes down, even in developing countries, because there's some assumption that eventually some of these cleaner standards kick in. But between now and then, there are a lot of mitigation opportunities to obviously accelerate the decline.
Let me just reiterate the point I made earlier about the speed of this trend, because I think it's absolutely fair in terms of the future look to take into account the impact of new emission standards, both ones that have been passed and ones that we hope will be passed based on commitments that other nations have made. But there's a global, as I mentioned, there's a global economic slowdown now. So the rate of the turnover of those fleets into those new cleaner engines is not happening as fast as was originally projected. So we're going to do a fair projection. We need to take that into account because there was certain economic assumptions that were made into those trends probably are no longer valid. So yes, we need to look forward. Yes, they'll be coming down. Looks like they won't be coming down as fast as otherwise we had hoped. And based on your view about what the future of the economy, both domestically and globally, looks like, it may take a long time for us to catch up with that curve.
Red tag.
David, the Department of State. We didn't say much about industrial emissions. It's my understanding that in China, that's one of the major sources of environment. So could you comment on that in terms of China and India, and also if there's possibilities of mitigation?
Okay. This is probably, we're finding this out in the work we're trying to do. It's one of the most poorly characterized source, and when we really don't understand that well, trying to get mitigation estimates or certainly cost estimates associated with these sources is really, really difficult. And it may, I think it's also one of the inventory, the error bars around the emissions inventory from industrial sources from Asian Africa are quite large. One of the brick films looking are some of the key industrial sources, and they're kind of in a smaller scale. You just don't have those kind of sources here. So I guess the short answer is we know it's a significant source, but it's a very poorly characterized source.
Chris, you mentioned earlier some non-legal, non-legally binding action on addressing DC. Are there any already regulations legally binding piece of work that doesn't fall under a particular matter that addresses DC at any level?
The one exception may be California. I don't. Maybe
California, do you like duties?
Yeah. I mean, with the exception of California, I think there is no policy anywhere in the world right now that addresses black carbon specifically. So all of the relevant policies in place now address particular matter, not for climate reasons, but health reasons. So there is no, there's no kind of black carbon measures per se in different countries right now.
I think there's probably latent authority in your act is you need to do a black carbon measurement down for greenhouse gases, and that will trigger. Talk about what that triggers. Internationally, there's long-range transport pollution regimes that could identify black carbon, but currently don't as a separate pollutant. They extrapolate from particular matter. California, I believe, has just proposed looking at black carbon as a regulated pollutant with respect to light-duty vehicles, and it's trying to figure out what the metric should be with respect to climate impacts, how they calculate that. But I think that's right. That's the first. Maybe John.
Well, in Mexico, earlier this past February, the state of Florida, the draft plan of action actually was the first state to actually propose this. I don't know if this is yet fully operational. The governor of the state also, the governor Trump, he believed that his mother had died as a result of artificial disclosures. And it's one of the first reasons the environment secretary was strongly into the black carbon issue. But on the other hand, the governor steps down. This year, it's not quite clear what continuity. That at least is the first time the state actually abroad that is part of the issue.
And that triggers my recollection, actually, with respect to some climate action plans in New England. I think Connecticut and Massachusetts both included black carbon as part of the climate action plans. Now, that had to go through an implementation process. I'm not sure it's binding, but I think they would be credited under those plans. So there's at least domestic examples.
We have time for one more.
David Norton from Senator Udall's office. A couple weeks ago, I heard that EPA and DOT released new proposed rules for larger on-road vehicles or CAFA fuel standards. Could you speak to the possibility domestically of what that would mean for black carbon emissions? If those increases are substantial enough to make it into the dent of black carbon emissions with those bigger fuel switches?
Transportation person. I'll have to get back to you on that.
There was a way to think about that because the greenhouse gas, in essence, is like a statement for it's going to reduce fuel consumption, and so there'd be a relative black carbon benefit from the amount of fuel that's not being burned. Right? So that you can sort of figure out that as a percentage. I don't recall exactly, but it's in the low 10 sort of teens sort of percentage, as opposed to a direct intervention with respect to the filter, which is a 90% reduction from uncontrolled vehicles. So that's kind of the scale difference we're talking about here, but there should be a relative benefit from a fuel economy standard on trucks as well. But right now, the proposal does not include specifically.
I think we will end there. I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing their expertise today, and I think you've given us a lot of information to help the climate community and health community come together and hopefully make some real progress on this issue shortly. Please visit eesi.org if you'd like to download the slides later this afternoon. We'll also have a video posted in a couple days. And come check out the cook stoves, and maybe our speakers will be around for another couple minutes to answer any other questions. Thank you. Well, good morning and welcome. My name is Laura Parsons. I'm the Communications Director for the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. We're here today to talk about black carbon, a component of soot that has serious implications for disease and mortality rates all across the globe, and although not a greenhouse gas, also contributes to global climate change. So we're very pleased that we have an expert panel here today to help walk us through some of the climate science, help us understand the magnitude of the health problem, and better yet, to talk about some of the solutions. So without further ado, I think we should get right into it, and I'll introduce Ben D'Angelo, Senior Analyst for Climate Change Science and Policy with the EPA, and also co-chair for the Task Force on Short-Lived Climate Forcers for the Arctic Council. Ben.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to jump right into it, so I'll try to be brief so that we have more time for Q&A. So what I'm going to cover is just some black carbon 101, mostly on the science. One of my key messages is that the science is evolving on this topic. We don't have all of the answers yet about the climate effects, but there is a lot of work going on, and I think we're getting there in terms of better answers. I'll show you some of the ongoing efforts that are happening both within EPA and outside of EPA. There is a lot going on this topic right now, and then at the end and throughout, I'll give you what I think are some key messages on this issue, given the state of knowledge and the evolving state of knowledge. So just some basic points really lead to what is referred to as dimming, surface dimming, because it's absorbing incoming sunlight, which means sometimes it blocks sunlight from reaching the surface. And it has the unique feature of darkening snow and ice. So it can change the reflectivity of snow and ice surfaces. So these are all things that you don't really have to worry about with greenhouse gases. And basically, it's a little more. There's more going on. It's more complicated than greenhouse gases. Also, there's no standard definition for black carbon. So, for example, when you read through the literature, sometimes people talk about black carbon, sometimes you see elemental carbon, sometimes you see soot, and there are people use different definitions, and this is part of the issue for black carbon, and this has been recognized as an issue, and people recognize that some kind of greater standardization would improve our understanding, especially when you compare one study to another. Some of the implications of these differences is one, when you reduce emissions of black carbon, you get a more immediate response with the climate, whereas with greenhouse gases, there's more of a lag time from emission reduction to climate effect. The effects are a little more uncertain, and this also means the location of black carbon mitigation measures matters a lot more in terms of climate effects versus greenhouse gases. So for greenhouse gases, you really don't have to worry about where the emission takes place, or and likewise where the mitigation activity takes place. But for black carbon, location is kind of everything, because that will determine the climate effect. Next slide. Okay. There are some more stuff attached to it, like more hydrogen and other things like that, and it tends to be like the whitish smoke you might see from campfire or something like that. When you see that whitish smoke, a lot of that, more of that is organic carbon. So hope that helps. Yeah.
Secondary organic carbon, and that's also whitish.
Yes.
So, and that's the main part of this. It's all white.
Okay. So black carbon in the Arctic, like I said, because black carbon can deposit on snow and ice and darken the surface, this effect is causing an additional warming effect. And there's a lot of attention being focused on the Arctic now, because the Arctic is warming more than any other place on the Earth. And there is work going on to investigate to what extent black carbon may be contributing to the very high rates of warming we see in the Arctic. The graph I'm showing you there is one study. It's not the final word, but it's one study that showed that if you look at how CO2 and black carbon are contributing to warming at the global scale versus just at the Arctic scale, according to this study, black carbon is having a much greater, almost disproportionate effect on warming in the Arctic versus at the global scale. And it's because of this kind of amplified snow and ice effect. Next slide. So the same is true for other areas where there's a lot of snow and ice, a lot of snow and glacier dominated areas. For example, there's now some work going on looking at to what extent black carbon may be causing. Could you click again? There's some words missing on this slide. Oh, there we go. This is IPCC's kind of classic bar chart showing the warming effects of different greenhouse gases and other aerosols. So the red bars are warming, the blue bars are cooling. CO2 is the top bar. It's the dominant anthropogenic warming agent in the atmosphere. And then further down, you have black carbon. So you see that black carbon according to the IPCC estimate, does cause a significant warming effect at the global scale. And if you could just click again. But the complicating factor is that black carbon is co-emitted with things that cause cooling. So black carbon is always co-emitted with organic carbon, which essentially has the opposite effect, a cooling effect. And this black carbon to organic carbon ratio varies depending on the source. So diesel vehicles, for example, very rich in BC, little OC. So probably a good candidate for a climate strategy. Something like wildfires, biomass burning, huge source of black carbon, but you get lots of organic carbon with it. So as a climate mitigation strategy, probably a little more iffy. Next slide. Black carbon in the Arctic. This is receiving a huge amount of attention now. Should I get questions now, or do you want to wait? Black carbon is black carbon is more of a pure pure carbon substance. So it's the stuff that remains uncombusted. You know, when you see blackish smoke coming out of an old bus, a lot of that is black carbon. Organic carbon has more. First of all, black carbon. Most of you may already know this, but black carbon is a component of particulate matter, PM, which we already regulate in this country and a lot of countries for air quality purposes. So not for climate purposes, but we have been regulating and successfully controlling particulate matter emissions for air quality and health reasons, not for climate reasons, and black carbon is a component of that. Black carbon, it's different from a greenhouse gas. It's an aerosol. It absorbs incoming sunlight, and that's how it has a warming effect. I'll talk about the differences with greenhouse gases. One of the key reasons why black carbon is being considered for a climate change strategy in the first place is not only because it appears to have a significant warming effect, but when you reduce emissions of black carbon, you can get essentially an immediate effect or possible benefit on the climate because it is short-lived in the atmosphere. And some significant climate science uncertainties remain, and we'll kind of talk about these. So next slide. So a little bit more about some of the key differences between black carbon and the greenhouse gases. You know, first of all, like I mentioned, it's very short-lived in the atmosphere. So days to weeks is how long it may last in the atmosphere once it's emitted. Greenhouse gases, on the other hand, can last anywhere from decades to literally centuries. And this means that black carbon, unlike greenhouse gases, they are not well mixed in the atmosphere. So their concentrations will vary significantly over space and over time. Greenhouse gases are essentially uniformly mixed in the atmosphere when they're emitted. Black carbon can also affect precipitation rates because it can affect cloud formation. It can actually